have anything to offer us, and they really didn't seem too interested in working with us. So we went to somebody else. Wix came in and said, we'll work with you. And we worked with them and came up with a filter that had a synthetic filter medium, and it had a lot more area, and it had a better can. It had a higher relief pressure, so that when the differential gets higher across the filter, it wouldn't relieve at too low a pressure. And the pressure drop across that filter was half of what the other filter was. It was 6 or 7 psi or something like that. So we really liked the filter, so we stuck with that. And then the manufacturer of the production filter came back and said, well, we can do the same thing. So they actually improved the standard Hemi filter that's out there today. It's very much like the SRT filter. I don't think it's quite as good still, but it's a much improved version of what it was originally. So, I feel like we helped improve the overall brand with what we did on the Viper. That was for Gen 4. But we went backwards, and they made a filter available for the older Gen 3s and 2s, the 836 part number filter. And that's a very good filter. It's just like the Gen 4, Gen 5.
Can you actually buy a Wix filter?
Yeah, you can. You can go to your Napa store, and a Wix Napa Gold filter is basically the same filter. So if you can't get one at Mopar, get a Napa Gold.
So why should stick with the fiber filter? Rather than the old day?
Yeah. Yeah, and we looked at a lot of filters, and you can get some really bad ones. Fram was terrible filters. You hardly see what you hear. K&N filters, we looked at those. We looked at the Mobile One filters. The Mobile One filters were good filters, but believe it or not, they have a thicker shell. I think it was something like 2.1, 2.2 millimeter thick, where the standard shell on like the filter we've got is 1.5 millimeters thick. And you think, oh, that's a good thing. So we started running those on the dyno, and after about 40 or 50 hours on the dyno, the filter would crack. And it'd start leaking oil. But what would happen is that filter was just stiff enough where it just didn't have enough compliance, enough to give as you get pressure fluctuations, which you get. So with oil can, it would crack the filter. So, it was obviously not a good choice for us at that point. But, it's an example of a manufacturer going in with good intentions, thinking, oh, thicker is going to be better. When in reality, it didn't work for us. Because with the Viper, you'll see as much as 300, 400 psi peak to peak pressure fluctuations when it's cold. If you look at it real time, so it can get pretty high.
Okay.
Yeah.
In regards to antifreeze, are all antifreezes created equal, additive packages? And another question, on my Volvo engine I have in my Volvo, 12 liter, they have a filter for the antifreeze. Is that a good thing or a bad thing to have on a car?
Well, that depends on the antifreeze, I think. Part of an antifreeze package is anti-corrosive additives, depending on your block material and cylinder head material and such. If the antifreeze is doing its job, you shouldn't end up with too much contamination, I wouldn't think. That'd be a good question for Scott if I can get him here, but I think he'd probably tell you that they would probably say that's really not necessary with a good antifreeze as long as you keep the antifreeze reasonably fresh. And do you need to flush it every year? Of course not. Every 5 to 10 years is probably plenty with the antifreezes they have today. 10 years is no big deal. The old antifreezes that were just glycol-based, 5 years is probably about it for those. And then they'd start to break down and you could get corrosion, and that's that's when you start needing a filter. So is it a closed system on your boat?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
One of the unique things they do with that coolant filter is they also have an additive package that disintegrates over time.
Yeah.
So it's always adding different chemicals
Yeah.
to your fluid.
Yeah. Yeah, probably anti-corrosive agents and detergents. Yeah, there's stuff in there that will actually coat the block and the heads to keep it from corroding. So as long as you've got a fairly good antifreeze, you should be all right with that.
Is it a good idea to consider changing the antifreeze based on time or hours of use?
That's a tough question. I think a lot of that depends on how you use it. It's like oil. If I'm not going to start my cars up and let them run for at least half an hour, and I don't mean just idling in the driveway, I mean driving it, I won't start it up at all. Because you want the oil it has to get hot enough to burn off any contaminants, blow by gasoline, condensation, different acids you get from the combustion processes. So if you don't get it fully up to operating temperature, don't start it. And I think coolant's similar in some respects that way, that if you don't get it hot, it doesn't do its job very well. So if you get it hot every time you use it, you're not just starting it up and letting it sitting, you can probably go twice as long as you could if you don't. Same with oil. Yeah, trans, axle, everything, yeah.
In addition to that, could you go into oil analysis? There's a lot of companies that send in an oil sample and they'll analyze it. I found out from Caterpillar who I use as a convenient location of getting the sampling kits and their laboratory that they use that I got to get a tour at up in Wisconsin, that they also recommend checking your antifreeze every year for contaminants. And I was told you can tell a lot more from antifreeze than you can from oil on the condition of your engine, whether that's true or not. The fact is that if you're checking both, you're getting a good idea of what's happening to your engine.
Well, I don't know about the antifreeze statement, but I can't say that I know because we never did that. We did use the infrared oil analysis machines. We had some at Chrysler. We used them in durability. And it's a great tool as long as you use it from day one. And you have a history with it. You can't just take it to somebody, the car's got 20,000 miles on it. I bring you my oil, you do a sample and you say, oh gee, your iron's high. Well, yeah, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. For that engine, it depends on kind of where it started. So you need to develop a history with it to really get an idea of what's taken place. And every machine is a little different. Depending on how well it's maintained and so forth, how often it's cleaned, it'll give you different results. So we were at Le Mans in 2013 and we'd been watching the oil samples and Shell offered to do them for free, so we would do it on a regular basis. Well, we got there and all of a sudden, we had high iron and high aluminum content and high lead content, much higher than we were used to seeing. They had a machine right on site there at Le Mans where they would do it for you. It was just, it's just a difference in the machine. But it kind of put a scare in us initially that, do we have trouble going on both engines? It seems unlikely. They sounded fine, they seemed fine. And at the end of the day, they were fine. It was really just a shift in the level of the machine.
As of that, your oil starts off with certain levels of additives as well.
Yeah.
So we had a customer of ours that sent his oil out, I wouldn't say religiously, but like once a year he'll do it. We have a customer that with several different cars, including Vipers, and he would send his oil samples out, and it was like, well, he would see variations upon on the cars, whether it's an older car or a Viper or even a newer car. He does it across the board. Just he's a technical kind of guy. He wants to have all the information. One of the things that we suggested to him is sending in the different oils that he's using with nothing being run in an engine. So virgin oil out of the oil container to see what's in the oil versus what's coming out in his test results. And that was kind of interesting because it did, some of the stuff was just from the oil itself. And you could tell the differences between like an older engine that used more silicone in the gaskets and that type of thing, and then it had silicone in the oil. So it made sense. Or if it had a cast iron block, it automatically had more iron in it versus the one that had the aluminum block. So there was, the test results varied. It wasn't like standard across the board. And as Dick said, you know, unless you're doing it from day one, it's really hard to say. What are you comparing it to? Because everything's different. Everything's gonna wear to a certain extent. You're gonna get some sort of contamination from wear. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's in a failure mode. It's just wear from wear. So, you know, you have to take it with a grain of salt and, you know, kind of analyze that and make your best judgment. You obviously know your car more than anybody else. You drive it every day, things like that. One of the things that we do that isn't good is cutting open the oil filter. That seems to be a pretty good, you know, indication of what's going on versus minute particles in oil. If it's floating around in oil and you can't see it, odds are it's probably not going to do anything to your engine anyways. When you get into big particles and stuff like that are getting caught in your oil filter that you can physically see, those can cause damage. Because you can't see 1/1000th of an inch. You can't see 2/1000th of an inch. 3, you get a little light, maybe you probably can see a flake in the sun or something. So the particles are so fine that they're liquid and they're passing through an oil filter, more than likely, you're probably not causing anything. So you have to look out for, you know, the bigger stuff. So cutting open the oil filter once in a while is a pretty good idea.
Can you explain the best process to cut your filter open without contaminating the inside?
They sell an oil filter cutter that's very much like the,
Tubing cutter?
no, it's similar to a tubing cutter, but it's more like the can opener in your house. The best thing is don't cut your fingers because they are sharp and the oil filter becomes sharp. So if you go online and look up oil filter cutter, we have one up in the front. It's got wheels on it just like a can opener. You twist it on there similar to a tubing cutter and spin it around a dozen times and the top of the oil filter pops off and it's got oil in it and it's got a pleated element inside. Obviously when you're working with oil and sharp edges and stuff like that, there's a good chance you're going to cut yourself. So wear gloves or something at least. That's number one before you do any of it. And at the bottom of the oil filter, you're probably going to see some sparkles. You know, it's going to look like metallic paint, probably the bottom of the oil filter. Most times, sometimes no. It all depends on, you know, the age of the engine, how long the oil has been in there, you know, different things. Sometimes we've seen debris from oil filter manufacturing in oil filters. It's a possibility. So you have to take everything kind of, you know, ask questions. I know that some of the guys are seeing it, post a little piece of metal up on the thing, and come to find out it was a grommet from an oil pan gasket that he found in the oil pan. You know, and it wasn't anything from the engine. So, you know, but it's a good idea to check. I mean, if you're nervous or concerned about it, like I say, you can check the filter, pull the pan down. Luckily, the cars, the Vipers, very easy to pull the oil pan down on. Very easy. And, you know, obviously you'll see if there's junk built up in there or debris or anything like that. Now, oil, we change on a regular basis. Typically 3,000 miles or less, depending on less or, you know, per time. Some guys once a year, whatever the case may be. Can anybody tell me why we don't change our diff and trans fluid as often as we do our oil as often as we do oil. The reason is that with an engine, oil is contaminated by combustion. Therefore, it breaks down faster. Your rear differential and your transmission don't have any combustion, acid and different things from the fuels. So that's why transmissions and differentials can take and have a more extended interval. Obviously, the same principles apply when you do change them. You've got to look for excessive wear, look for lots of metallic in them. They don't have filters in them, but the clearances are quite a bit bigger on those. They use roller bearings, that type of thing, hardened steel bearings, running on hardened steel races. It's not aluminum and it's not hydraulically floated as such an engine crankshaft, to where the oil, the crankshaft is not riding on a bearing material, it's technically riding on a film of oil. It's suspended in space. If you're familiar with hydraulics at all, and spool valves, it's the same principle. The valve is centered on a very, very, very thin layer of high pressure oil. It doesn't touch the metal surfaces. So when you see damage in an engine where you're getting damage from a bearing, from crank hitting a bearing, that type of thing, the oil has gone away from that area. It's not necessarily that the crank's riding on that bearing drill in a specific spot and you've lost your film of oil in between the two parts. So that's generally a thin, as Dick's just stated, a thicker oil is harder to break down that film. That film is thousandths of an inch thick, and as you know, if you put it on the table here and you had two different thicknesses of oil or water or something, and you took a block of wood and pushed on a real thin liquid, you could push it and squeeze out all the, say, water from underneath the one. And then I go over here and put a layer of honey over here and put a piece of wood on it, that same piece of wood, and try pushing it down, try pushing all that honey out of there. You probably won't be able to do it because of the thickness of that honey. It's going to stay in there and it's going to hold itself together. It's very similar to what's happening in your engine. And if you lose that film, then yes, your crankshaft will touch your bearings, and that's when bad things start happening. If that film is maintained, there's no reason that it should have any wear.
Is it better to change your oil at the end of the season or beginning of the season?
Do you like Pepsi or Coke?
Less likely to have sludge develop.
That's what I've heard. End of the season.
Yeah.
I have a question, as far as when you let's say hypothetically, if you were going to drive your Viper in a hot climate like say Dallas, for example, is there anything I can do to help enhance
Coolant? Enhance,
any water weather, anything
how
else?
to make it more efficient, more
Yeah,
effective?
any special?
You know, the biggest thing with coolant is making sure the air going into the front of the car goes through the radiator. That honestly, that's one of the biggest mistakes people make. You know, my car doesn't cool well. And you go out and you look at the car and it's got big gaps between the front closure panel or the bumper beam or whatever that seals that radiator up so that all the air goes through. Had a guy emailing me last week. He had bought an ACRX and it wouldn't run more than, he said, 2 or 3 laps and it would overheat. And I told him, I said, gee, we never had a problem with that. We ran a pallet, it was 110 degrees, and they'd get up to 250 or so, but that's okay. You know, it's not desirable, it's not where you want to be, but it won't hurt anything. But he said, you know, the thing would get up over